Protectionism involves protecting domestic industries from competition from abroad by making it more difficult for overseas businesses to export to your country. And the main ways for governments to do this would be through tariffs, quotas, legislation, or subsidies. Tariffs are taxes on imports, and the idea here is that you make it more expensive for foreign producers to export to your country. They then struggle to compete with your domestic producers, who obviously don't have to pay the tariffs. So foreign producers experience falling demand as consumers switch to the cheaper domestic alternatives. Quotas are physical limits on imports, and in practice this has a very similar impact to the tariffs, but rather than making the imports more expensive, you simply limit the amount coming in, which means more demand then for the domestic producers. Legislation is maybe less of an obvious and direct method of protectionism, but differences in laws and regulations between countries can make it very difficult for producers selling in a number of different international locations to adapt and adjust. The domestic producers are used to the laws and are set up for them, which means they can then gain a competitive advantage. Or governments can subsidise domestic production using direct payments to producers. That reduces their costs of production, making them more competitive than overseas competition. The main winners from protectionist policies will be domestic businesses. The whole idea of the policies are to protect them from being outcompeted by international rivals. And one of the key justifications for doing this is what's called the infant industry argument. And the idea with this being that large multinational companies which operate across borders will have the major advantage of benefiting from economies of scale. This reduces their unit costs as they grow, meaning they can undercut smaller domestic businesses with their pricing. And the infant industry argument says that you use protectionist policies like tariffs, quotas, subsidies, while they're small, to give them that time to grow. And once they're of a size to be able to compete with those larger rivals, then those protectionist measures can be removed. Another argument is that excessive importing causes structural unemployment. And this is when jobs are lost because of particular industries going into decline, and can be really damaging to whole communities where these industries might have been dominant. So by using the protectionist policies, you're not just protecting the businesses, but also their workers and wider communities as well. And one which is specific to tariffs, as well as discouraging imports, they can have the added benefit of raising revenue as well, which governments can then spend in other areas. Now, the big losers from policies of protectionism will be consumers. Tariffs will drive up prices, as will excessive legislation, which increases the cost of doing business. Quotas restrict choice by limiting imports from abroad. And implementing these measures designed to protect domestic businesses will be harmful to overseas businesses, and so their governments might introduce their own protectionist policies in retaliation and result in trade wars where there will be no winners and all exporters will suffer. Specifically, policies like legislation and subsidies, unlike tariffs which raise revenue, can be really costly to implement as well. Now ultimately, there'll always be winners and losers, and it really depends on which stakeholders' interests are to be prioritised. And generally speaking, it's domestic businesses and their workers who will benefit from these policies, but consumers who will lose out.